U.S. But it's not just policy.
We're just making it the same.
On the eve of a trade deadline,
and Canada.
With America, the agreement stayed alive, and the worst case that so many businesses had been bracing for simply did not arrive. And yet, if you look past that reassuring headline, you run straight into something that does not fit the mood of relief at all. Because every single one of the punishing tariffs that Donald Trump piled onto Canadian steel, onto Canadian aluminum, onto Canadian cars, and onto Canadian lumber is still standing exactly where he left it. Not one of them was lifted. Not one of them was softened. Prime Minister Mark Carney kept the framework of the deal intact, but the levies that actually bite into Canadian factories and mills and workers were left completely untouched. So how does free trade survive and still leave the country carrying the full weight of the tariffs it wanted gone the most? That is the puzzle I want to walk you through, because the answer tells you far more about where this relationship is heading than any celebration ever could. Let me set the scene properly, because the two facts sitting side by side are what make this story so strange. On the one hand, the agreement that governs trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico stayed in force after the 1st of July. That agreement, known in Canada as CUSMA, is the modern successor to the old North American Free Trade Arrangement, and it is the spine of an economic relationship worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Roughly 85% of everything the United States imports from Canada continues to cross the border without a tariff attached to it. Think about that number for a second. The overwhelming majority of Canadian goods flowing south still move freely, still arrive without a penalty, still keep the supply chains that both economies depend on running smoothly. If you stopped reading right there, you would conclude that Canada dodged a very large bullet, and in one sense you would be right. But here is where the story turns, and where I want you to slow down with me. The review of the deal, the moment when Canada hoped to get some real movement, changed nothing on the tariffs that hurt the most. The framework held, yes, but the specific, targeted, sector-by-sector tariffs that Trump imposed on Canadian steel, on Canadian aluminum, on Canadian automobiles, and on Canadian lumber were all kept in place. These are not obscure line items buried in a trade schedule. These are the pillars of Canada's industrial economy. Steel and aluminum feed everything from construction to manufacturing. The auto sector employs enormous numbers of people and is woven directly into American assembly lines. Lumber underpins a huge slice of the resource economy and has been at the center of cross-border disputes for decades. And all four of them walked out of this process carrying the exact same tariff burden they walked in with. So when you hear that free trade survived, you have to ask a very pointed question. Free trade for whom and for which products? Because for the 85% that already moved freely, nothing much was ever really in doubt. The battle was always over the other slice, the industrial heart of the matter, the sectors where Trump chose to plant his tariffs deliberately, and where the pain lands hardest. And on that battlefield, Canada did not win an inch. The headline that says free trade lives is technically accurate, but it quietly steps around the part of the story that Canadian workers and Canadian companies actually care about most. This is the fresh angle I really want to dwell on, because it reframes the entire outcome.
Called, and we'll see.
in the White House document, he complains Canada has failed to cooperate in curbing the ongoing flood of fentanyl and is
The reassuring phrase, "free trade survives," hides the real story, and the real story is almost the opposite of reassuring. The sectoral tariffs that Canada most wanted lifted are precisely the ones that did not move. Not by accident, not as a temporary holdover, but as the settled state of things after the dust cleared. And you do not have to take my interpretation for it, because Canada's own trade minister said as much. The stated priority coming out of all this was to pursue substantive talks on American sectoral tariffs, on the levies hitting Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. Read that carefully. When your government tells you that its top priority is to negotiate those specific tariffs, that is a plain admission that those tariffs are still there, still unresolved, still very much a problem. You do not make something a negotiating priority if you have already won it. That admission matters because it strips away the comfortable interpretation. It would be easy to walk away believing that keeping the framework intact means the hard part is behind us. It is not. The framework staying alive keeps the door open, keeps the broader relationship functional, keeps that 85% flowing. But the biggest irritants, the ones that generate the most heat between Ottawa and Washington, are still sitting on the table exactly where they were. The deal did not remove them. The deal simply agreed to keep talking about them another day. And in trade, a promise to keep talking is not the same thing as relief. It is a holding pattern, and holding patterns come with a cost of their own. Let me explain what that cost actually looks like on the ground, because this is where the abstract language of tariffs turns into something real. When a steel producer in Canada faces a tariff selling into the American market, that producer has to make a choice: absorb the cost and watch margins shrink, or pass the cost along and watch American customers look elsewhere. Either way, the business becomes less competitive against rivals who do not face the same penalty. The same logic runs through aluminum, through the auto sector, through lumber. Every one of those industries now has to plan around a tariff that makes selling into their single largest market more expensive and more uncertain. And uncertainty, in the world of business investment, is almost as damaging as the tariff itself. That brings me to the stakes, and to the part of this story that reaches well beyond the four industries directly targeted. The trade risks and the uncertainties facing Canada did not disappear when the framework was preserved. They persist. They are still there, humming in the background of every boardroom decision, and they are likely to weigh on private sector investment across a whole range of industries, not just the ones with a tariff stamped on them. This is the quiet, corrosive effect that does not make a dramatic headline, but does real damage over time. When a company cannot be confident about the terms on which it will sell into the United States, it hesitates. It delays the new plant. It postpones the expansion. It holds the cash instead of committing it to a project that might take years to pay off. Multiply that hesitation across an economy, and you get slower growth, fewer jobs created, and a competitive position that erodes quietly rather than collapsing loudly. And this is why the survival of the framework, while genuinely important, is not the whole victory it might appear to be. Yes, the structure held. Yes, the catastrophic rupture was avoided. But a business does not invest based on a structure that held. It invests based on confidence about the future. And confidence is exactly what these lingering tariffs and open questions undermine. A company weighing whether to build in Canada or shift production somewhere else is not comforted by the news that 85% of trade flows freely. It is worried about the 15%, about the sectors under pressure, about whether the next round of talks brings relief or brings new restrictions. That worry is a tax of its own, one that does not show up in any tariff schedule, but shapes decisions all the same. Now, I want to be fair and complete here, because there is another side to this that Canadians can take some genuine comfort in. As frustrating as the situation is, Canada is actually better positioned than most of the other countries trading with the United States. That is not a small point. Almost every other major American trading partner has been hit with tariffs that are higher and applied far more broadly since early 2025. In other words, while Canada is stuck fighting to remove tariffs on 4 key sectors, many other nations are dealing with penalties that cover a much wider sweep of their exports and land with even greater force. Canada's tariffs are painful and concentrated. Elsewhere, the tariffs are painful and everywhere.
CBC. Evan, thanks so much for your time. Could you tell us a bit more about Carney's decision to lift these retaliatory tariffs? Why is he doing it now?
So when you measure Canada against the field, it is carrying a lighter overall load, even if the specific weights it is carrying feel enormous to the industries bearing them. This comparison is worth holding on to, because it explains part of the strategy behind preserving the framework at all costs. If the rest of the world is being pulled into a tougher and broader tariff environment, then keeping that 85% tariff-free is not nothing. It is a real advantage in a landscape where advantages are getting harder to find. A Canadian exporter selling most goods without penalty into the American market still enjoys an edge over a competitor from a country facing steep tariffs across the board. That edge is exactly what the framework protects, and it helps explain why the government treated preserving the deal as non-negotiable, even while accepting that the sectoral tariffs would stay in place for now. It was a choice between defending the broad relationship and holding out for the narrow wins, and Canada chose to lock in the broad relationship first. But choosing to defend the framework does not make the sectoral pain go away, and it does not resolve the underlying tension. And that tension is about to get sharper, which brings me to what happens next, and to the accusations now flying across the border. From the American side, a U.S. official accused Ottawa of failing to address many of the non-tariff barriers and trade challenges that Washington has raised. This is a crucial piece of the picture, because it tells you the disagreement is not only about tariffs. Non-tariff barriers are all the other ways a country can make it harder for foreign goods and services to compete. Regulations, standards, licensing rules, restrictions in certain sectors, the fine print that shapes who can sell what and under what conditions. And the American complaint is that Canada has left too many of those in place, that Ottawa has not moved on the issues Washington cares about.
Now think about how that changes the negotiation. If the American position is that Canada still has work to do on non-tariff barriers, then Washington has a ready-made argument for keeping its own tariffs exactly where they are. It becomes a standoff. Canada says, "Lift your tariffs on our steel and aluminum and autos and lumber." The United States replies, "First deal with the barriers we have been raising for months." Each side points at the other. Each side says, "You go first," and the tariffs that hurt Canadian industry stay frozen in place while the argument continues. That is the mechanism by which a temporary situation quietly hardens into a permanent one. Nobody has to decide to make these tariffs the new normal. They just have to keep failing to agree, and the status quo does the rest.
Which lands us on the single open question that sits at the very heart of this entire story. Can Mark Carney trade something away in order to win tariff relief, or will these levies on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber simply become the permanent backdrop of Canadian trade? That is the question I would keep my eye on above everything else, because relief, if it comes, will almost certainly come at a price. The Americans are not signaling that they will drop these tariffs out of goodwill. They are signaling that they want concessions, that they have a list of grievances, that movement on the tariffs is tied to movement on the barriers and challenges they keep raising. So Carney's real challenge is not just to ask for relief, it is to figure out what Canada is willing to give in exchange, and whether that price is one the country can politically and economically afford to pay. And that is a genuinely difficult calculation because concessions are never free either. Anything Canada offers to soften American tariffs on steel or lumber has to be weighed against what that concession costs Canadians in some other sector or some other principle. Trade negotiations are a web of trade-offs, and pulling one thread tightens another somewhere else. Carney has to decide how much political capital, how much economic ground, and how much of Canada's own regulatory independence he is prepared to spend in the pursuit of relief for four industries. Give too little, and the tariffs stay. Give too much, and he wins relief in steel while opening a wound somewhere less visible. There is no clean version of this. There is only the hard arithmetic of what each side wants badly enough to pay for.
Let me pull the threads together because I think the shape of the whole situation becomes clear once you see it laid out.
Canada preserved the framework of its trade relationship with the United States, and that framework keeps the vast majority of its exports moving freely, which is a real and meaningful protection in a world where tariffs are spreading. That is the good news, and it deserves to be recognized honestly.
Finalizing a deal to transfer TikTok ownership.
Well, I think China is a lot more complicated than Russia, and we have a lot more.
But the framework surviving did nothing to lift the tariffs that Canada wanted gone the most, the ones on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber, and the government's own words confirm that those tariffs remain the central unresolved problem. Those tariffs continue to create uncertainty that ripples out well beyond the industries directly targeted, weighing on investment decisions across the economy and quietly shaping choices that will determine growth for years. And the path to removing them runs straight through a negotiation where the Americans are already accusing Canada of not doing enough, which means relief, if it arrives at all, will have to be purchased with concessions that carry costs of their own. So the tidy headline, "Free trade survives," turns out to be true and misleading at the same time. It is true because the deal held, and most trade flows freely. It is misleading because it invites you to believe the hard part is over, when in reality the hard part, the fight over the tariffs that actually hurt, has barely begun. Canada did not lose this round, but it did not win the fight that mattered most either. It secured a foundation and postponed the reckoning. Whether that reckoning ends in relief or ends in these tariffs becoming a permanent feature of the landscape depends entirely on what happens in the talks still to come, on how hard Washington pushes, and on how much Carney is willing to put on the table to get his steel, his aluminum, his autos, and his lumber out from under the weight that Trump placed on them. I would add one more layer here, because it helps explain why this drama is unlikely to fade quietly. Trade between these two countries is not a distant, abstract matter for either economy. It is deeply personal for the workers whose plants depend on selling into the American market, for the towns built around a mill or a factory, For the industries that have spent generations building supply chains that cross the border many times before a finished product ever reaches a customer. When a tariff sits on Canadian steel or aluminum, it is not just a number in a policy document. It touches the order book of a real company and the paycheck of a real worker. That is why the government treats these four sectors as a priority, even after preserving the broader deal. And it is why the pressure to resolve them will not simply go away. The political weight behind these industries guarantees that Ottawa cannot let the tariffs quietly settle into permanence without a fight, even if that fight is uphill. At the same time, Washington has every incentive to hold its position and extract as much as it can before giving anything back. From the American perspective, the tariffs are leverage, and leverage is only valuable while you still hold it. Give it away too cheaply, and you have wasted it. So the American side has a reason to keep the pressure on, to keep pointing at the non-tariff barriers, to keep insisting that Canada move first. This is the uncomfortable dynamic that Canada now has to navigate. It preserved the relationship precisely so it would have a stable base from which to negotiate. But that same stability may reduce the urgency on the American side to offer relief. Why rush to lift tariffs when the overall relationship is functioning and the pressure is mostly falling on the other side of the border? That is the trap Canada has to work its way out of, and it explains why the coming negotiations matter so much. There is a broader lesson tucked inside all of this that I think is worth naming. In modern trade, the headline outcome and the real outcome are often two different things. A deal can be preserved while the substance most people care about goes unresolved. A relationship can be called stable while specific industries live in constant uncertainty. And a government can claim, accurately, that free trade survived while the very tariffs its people wanted lifted remain firmly in place. None of that is dishonest exactly, but it requires you to read past the reassuring line to the harder truth underneath. The story of Canada, the United States, Trump, Carney, and these stubborn sectoral tariffs is a perfect example of that gap between the comforting summary and the complicated reality. The summary says survival. The reality says a fight deferred, a bill unpaid, and a set of open questions that will shape the economic future of an entire country. So as we close this out, the picture I want to leave you with is not one of disaster and not one of triumph, but one of unfinished business. Canada kept its free trade with America, and that is real. But the punishing tariffs on steel, aluminum, cars, and lumber that Trump piled on are all still there, and that is just as real. The framework bought time and preserved an advantage. It did not solve the problem. And the question of whether Carney can convert concessions into relief, or whether these levies quietly harden into the permanent price of doing business with the United States, is the question that everything now hinges on. Keep watching that negotiation, because that is where the true outcome of this whole affair will finally be written, long after the headlines about survival have faded from memory. Thank you so much for watching my breakdown of the Canada and United States trade situation, and of the tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber that Trump left in place even as free trade under the deal survived. If this helped you understand what is really going on behind that reassuring headline, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next update as this story between Ottawa and Washington keeps developing. I dig into the details that the quick headlines skip right over, and there is a lot more still to come on where Carney and these tariffs go from here. Thanks again for being here, and I will see you in the next one.